Jinu Park wiped the frost from his goggles and stared at the wreckage of his research station. The ice storm had been worse than anything in the weather records. His communication dish lay twisted like a broken umbrella, and half his equipment, trailers, were buried under 10 feet of snow and ice. The planet Frost 7 had never been friendly, but now it felt downright hostile. He kicked at a chunk of metal that used to be his backup generator. 3 months until the next supply ship was scheduled to arrive. 3 months alone on a planet where the daytime temperature never got above -40 degrees. His breath formed instant clouds that froze and fell like tiny ice crystals. The emergency shelter protocols were clear. Find the most protected spot, set up the thermal tent, ration everything, and pray the rescue beacon still worked. Jinu dragged his survival gear to a natural windbreak between 2 large ice formations. The work kept him warm, but he could feel the cold trying to seep through his thermal suit anyway. By the time he had the emergency tent assembled, the wind was howling again. The weather scanner showed another storm front approaching. This one looked even bigger than the last. Jinu sealed himself inside the tent and fired up the portable heater. The small space filled with blessed warmth, but he knew he had to be careful with fuel consumption. The second storm hit 3 hours later. The tent shook and rattled as wind speeds climbed past hurricane levels. Ice pelted the outer shell like machine gun fire. Jinu huddled in his sleeping bag, listening to the chaos outside and wondering if the tent would hold together. This was supposed to be a routine archaeological survey, not a survival situation. The storm raged for 2 full days. When it finally died down, Jinu suited up and ventured outside to check his perimeter sensors. The landscape had changed completely. New ice formations jutted up like crystal towers, and his original landing site was completely erased. Everything looked alien and hostile. That's when he saw her. A humanoid figure lay crumpled against an ice boulder about 50 meters from his tent. At first, Jinu thought it might be debris from his station, but as he got closer, he realized it was alive. The being had the basic shape of a human female, but her skin was pale blue and seemed to shimmer slightly. She wore what looked like a form-fitting bodysuit, made from some kind of metallic material. She wasn't moving. Jinu knelt beside her and checked for vital signs the way he'd been trained in basic first aid. Her pulse was extremely slow, and her skin felt like ice. Her breathing was so shallow he could barely detect it. Everything about her suggested severe hypothermia, the kind that killed people in minutes rather than hours. The smart thing would be to contact his supervisors first. There were strict protocols about alien contact, but his communication equipment was destroyed, and this being was clearly dying. She had obviously been caught in the same storm that had wrecked his station. Jinu made a decision that would change everything. He scooped the unconscious alien into his arms and carried her back to his tent. She was surprisingly light, almost like her bones were hollow. As he laid her down inside the warm shelter, he noticed that her eyelids were fluttering slightly. Maybe he could save her. Maybe they could help each other survive this frozen wasteland until rescue arrived. Jinu carefully placed the alien woman on his emergency sleeping mat and cranked up the portable heater. Her blue skin looked almost translucent in the tent's LED lighting, and he could see what appeared to be veins or pathways running just beneath the surface. She was definitely alive, but her condition looked critical. He grabbed his medical kit and started checking her temperature with an infrared thermometer. The readings made no sense. According to his instruments, her core body temperature was fluctuating wildly, jumping from dangerously low to normal and back again within seconds. Either his equipment was malfunctioning, or this alien's biology worked completely differently than human physiology. After about 20 minutes, her eyes fluttered open. They were large and completely silver, like mirrors reflecting the tent's interior. She blinked several times, then tried to sit up too quickly and immediately collapsed back down. Her mouth opened, and she made sounds that were almost musical, like someone humming a complex melody. A small device attached to her chest began blinking and emitting electronic beeps. Suddenly, words came out in heavily accented but understandable English. Cold, very cold, help needed. Jinu felt relief wash over him. At least they could communicate. "You're safe now," he said slowly. "I found you outside during the storm." "You're in my emergency shelter." She turned her head toward him and studied his face with those strange silver eyes. When she spoke again, her translator made her voice sound hollow and mechanical. "Gratitude. Warmth is necessary for survival." She tried to sit up again, this time managing to prop herself up on her elbows. Her gaze immediately went to the portable heater glowing in the corner of the tent. She pointed at it weakly and said something in her own language that the translator couldn't process. Jinu moved closer to help her get more comfortable. "Easy there. You've been through a lot. What's your name?" "Nari," she replied, the translator giving her voice a slightly musical quality even through the electronic processing. "Ship broken, storm too strong." So she was a crash survivor too. That explained a lot. Jinu felt a kinship with her immediately. They were both stranded on this frozen wasteland, both dependent on whatever supplies they could salvage. "I'm Jinu," he said. "My research station was destroyed in the same storm. We're both stuck here until rescue arrives." Nari nodded, but she seemed distracted. She kept looking around the tent, her eyes stopping at every heat source. The small camp stove, the heater, even his thermal coffee mug seemed to fascinate her. She pointed at each one and spoke rapid phrases in her own language. "Warmth sources. Many warmth sources," the translator managed to convert. Jinu assumed. She was just grateful for the heated environment after nearly freezing to death outside. He pulled an extra thermal blanket from his supplies and draped it over her shoulders. "This should help you warm up faster," he said. "I've got some hot soup heating up. You need to get your core temperature back to normal." But as soon as the blanket touched her skin, something strange happened. The fabric began to steam slightly, as if it was touching something much hotter than it should be. Jinu frowned and reached out to check her forehead for fever. Her skin felt warm. Not just warm, but noticeably hot. "That's weird," he muttered. "Your temperature seems to be rising pretty quickly." Nari watched him with those mirror-like eyes, and for just a moment, Jinu thought he saw something that looked like worry flash across her face. Over the next few hours, Jinu started noticing that something wasn't quite right with his alien guest. Nari seemed restless, constantly shifting position and moving around the small tent. At first, he thought she was just uncomfortable, or maybe in pain from her ordeal, but then he realized she was deliberately positioning herself closer and closer to anything that generated heat. She would slide toward the portable heater until she was almost touching it. When Jinu moved to prepare food on his camp stove, she would crawl over and sit right next to the burner. Her behavior reminded him of a cat seeking out warm spots, except there was something urgent about it, almost desperate. "Are you still cold?" Jinu asked, offering her another blanket. Nari shook her head quickly and said something in her language that the translator couldn't handle. She seemed frustrated, gesturing at the heater and then at herself. The few words that came through were, "not cold and different need." That's when Jinu's equipment started acting up. His digital thermometer began giving crazy readings, jumping from normal tent temperature to numbers that didn't make sense. According to the display, the air near Nari was sometimes over 100 degrees, which was impossible. He figured the device was broken from the storm damage and switched to his backup instruments. The backup thermometer did the same thing. Then his tablet computer started overheating. The screen showed multiple warning messages about internal temperature before shutting down completely. Jinu had never seen electronics fail like this before. He moved the tablet to the far corner of the tent, but even there it wouldn't restart properly. "That's really strange," he muttered, checking his other devices. His radio was making weird clicking sounds, and the battery pack was showing unusual drain patterns. Nari watched him troubleshoot his equipment with those silver eyes. She seemed to understand that something was wrong, and she looked worried. When she spoke, her translator managed to convey, "Sorry, not meaning to cause problems." Jinu looked up from his malfunctioning radio. "You think you're causing this?" Before she could answer, disaster struck. Nari had been sitting near his backup power generator, the one device he absolutely couldn't afford to lose. She reached out to steady herself and accidentally placed her palm directly on the generator's metal housing. There was a loud pop, followed by the smell of burning electronics. Sparks shot out from the generator's control panel, and then everything went dark. The generator's steady humming noise died completely. No, no, no! Jinoo scrambled over to the generator, but it was clearly dead. Smoke was coming from the internal components, and the metal housing where Nari had touched it was actually discolored, as if it had been exposed to intense heat. In the sudden darkness, with only the faint emergency lighting still working, Jinoo noticed something that made his blood run cold. Nari's skin was glowing. It wasn't bright, just a subtle blue-white luminescence like moonlight on water, but it was definitely there, emanating from her skin in soft pulses that seemed to match her heartbeat. In the dim tent, she looked almost ethereal, like some kind of deep-sea creature. "Jinoo," she said quietly, and her voice through the translator sounded scared. "Something happening to me. Cannot control." He stared at her glowing form, his mind racing. This wasn't hypothermia. This wasn't someone who needed to warm up. Whatever was happening to Nari involved heat, but not in any way he understood. His portable heater was still running on its internal battery, but as Nari moved closer to it, the device began making alarming beeping sounds. The temperature gauge was climbing into the red zone. Jinoo realized with growing dread that his alien guest wasn't seeking heat sources for warmth. She was affecting them somehow, making them hotter than they were designed to handle. And whatever process was happening inside her body was just getting started. Jinoo quickly shut off the portable heater and every other device that generated warmth. The tent should have started cooling down immediately in the sub-zero environment of Frost 7, but instead, the temperature kept climbing. His remaining functional thermometer showed readings that made him question his own sanity. 85 degrees. 90, 95. "This is impossible," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was down to his base layer clothing, and even that felt too warm. Outside it was 40 below zero. Inside the tent it felt like a sauna. Nari sat in the center of the space, and the glow from her skin had intensified dramatically. What had started as a faint luminescence now pulsed with bright blue-white light that made it hard to look directly at her. She was breathing heavily, and her silver eyes had taken on an almost panicked expression. "Jinoo," she gasped, her translator, struggling with her rapid speech. "Something wrong, so body changing, I cannot stop." She held up her hands, and Jinoo could see the light was strongest there, as if energy was building up in her palms. When she pressed her hands together, the glow became so bright that he had to shield his eyes. The tent's fabric walls began to sag and warp from the heat. Jinoo touched one of the support poles and immediately jerked his hand back. The metal was hot enough to burn skin. Everything inside the tent was becoming dangerously overheated, but it was the sounds from outside that really scared him. A steady dripping noise had started, like rain falling on the tent's exterior. Except it wasn't raining. Jinoo unzipped the tent flap slightly and peered out into the frozen landscape. What he saw made his stomach drop. The ice around his tent was melting. Fast, large chunks of frozen ground were turning to slush and running away in streams. The solid ice formations that had provided his windbreak were developing cracks and sending up wisps of steam. In the span of just a few minutes, his campsite was transforming from solid frozen ground into a muddy, unstable mess. "We need to get out of here," Jinoo said, turning back to Nari. But she was curled up on herself now, her whole body shaking despite the incredible heat she was generating. "Cannot move," she managed to say through the translator. "Process has begun. Cannot stop until finished." The thermometer now read over 100 degrees. Jinoo's emergency supplies were starting to show heat damage. His water bottles were hot to the touch, and the plastic containers were beginning to deform. The tent's ventilation system couldn't keep up with the temperature differential between inside and outside. Nari's glow intensified again, pulsing in waves that seemed to sync with some internal rhythm. Each pulse sent another wave of heat through the tent. The metal tent stakes holding down the corners were actually glowing red-hot, melting their way down through the ice beneath. Jinoo realized with growing horror that this wasn't just about his tent or his equipment anymore. If Nari's heat generation kept accelerating at this rate, she could destabilize the entire ice shelf they were camping on. The permafrost beneath them had probably never experienced temperatures like this in thousands of years. He could hear the ice shifting and creaking underneath them, making sounds like a ship breaking apart. Meltwater was beginning to pool around the tent's base, and he could feel the ground becoming soft and unreliable. "Nari, you have to tell me what's happening to you," he said urgently. "Is this normal for your species? Is there anything I can do to help?" She looked at him with those mirror-like eyes, and for the first time since he'd found her, he saw something that looked like fear mixed with resignation. "Thermal flowering," she whispered. "Happens once in lifetime. Usually we go far from others. Very dangerous." The temperature gauge hit 110 degrees, and Jinu felt his world start to fall apart. The tent was now swelteringly hot, and Jinu could barely think straight in the oppressive heat. Sweat poured down his face as he knelt beside Nari, who was glowing so brightly that she looked like a human-shaped star. Her translator device was sparking and overheating, but she was desperately trying to communicate something important. "Listen carefully," she gasped between waves of intense light pulses. "Must tell you a truth about what's happening." The translator crackled with static, but her words came through in fragments. "My people. We call it thermal flowering. Happens. Once, lifetime. Body creates massive heat for reproduction cycle." Jinu felt his blood run cold despite the suffocating temperature around them. "Reproduction? You mean this is natural?" Nari nodded weakly, her silver eyes filled with what looked like shame and terror. "Not choice. Biology takes control. Body becomes like burning star. Heat rises until—" She struggled to find words the translator could handle. "Until body ready for next life stage." The implications hit Jinu like a physical blow. This wasn't a medical emergency he could treat with blankets and hot soup. This was an alien biological process that was designed to generate enormous amounts of heat, and it was just getting started. "How hot does it get?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Hot enough to melt stone," she whispered. "Hot enough to change landscape. Hot enough to kill everything nearby." Through the damaged translator, she managed to explain more of the horrifying truth. Her ship hadn't crashed accidentally during the storm. Her crew had deliberately brought her to this remote ice world when they realized her thermal flowering was beginning. It was standard protocol for her species: isolate the individual on a lifeless planet where the heat generation couldn't cause casualties. "They left me here to protect others," she said, her voice breaking with emotion that came through even the mechanical translation. "Knew I would survive the process, but knew I would destroy everything around me." Ice World seemed safe choice. Jinu stared at her in disbelief. "They abandoned you here? Just left you to go through this alone?" "Is normal way," Nari replied sadly. "Thermal flowering is burden. Individual must bear alone, cannot risk others." The ground beneath them was making ominous creaking sounds now. Through the tent wall, Jinu could hear water rushing, as massive amounts of ice converted to liquid. The temperature gauge on his remaining equipment had stopped working altogether, probably because it wasn't designed to measure heat this extreme. "How long does this process last?" Jinu asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. "Several of your days," she said. "Gets much hotter before cooling begins. Usually triggers geological events, volcanic activity, steam explosions, changes entire region." Jinu looked around his tent, which was now sagging dangerously from the heat. His supplies were melting or burning. The ice shelf they were on was becoming unstable. In a few more hours, this entire area would probably be uninhabitable. The smart thing to do would be exactly what her crew had done: get as far away as possible and let nature take its course. Nari expected this. She was already trying to gesture. "For him to leave, you must go," she said urgently. "Take survival gear, walk far away. This process cannot be stopped. Will only get worse." But as Jinu looked at her glowing form, trembling with fear and resignation, he felt something stubborn rise up inside him. Her own people had abandoned her to face this terrifying transformation alone. The idea of doing the same thing made his stomach turn. "No," he said firmly. "There has to be another way." Nari stared at him with those mirror-like eyes, clearly shocked by his response. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I'm becoming living furnace. We'll destroy everything." Jinu wiped the sweat from his eyes and started looking around the tent with new determination. "Then we better figure out how to control a furnace." Jinu's geological sensors, the ones he'd been using for his archaeological survey, started beeping frantically from where they lay, scattered around the tent. Even damaged. From the storm, they were picking up readings that made no scientific sense. The seismic activity meters showed ground vibrations that shouldn't exist on a stable ice shelf. He grabbed the least damaged sensor and stared at the display in horror. Underground, massive sections of permafrost were liquefying at an alarming rate. The ice that had been frozen solid for thousands of years was turning to superheated steam faster than it could escape to the surface. "This is bad," he muttered, checking another instrument. "Really, really bad." The ground temperature readings were climbing past anything his equipment was designed to measure. 3 feet below them, ice was converting to pressurized steam. The entire foundation of their campsite was becoming unstable, like standing on top of a pressure cooker that was about to explode. Nari's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her skin now blazed with light so intense that looking directly at her was like staring at welding equipment. Heat waves shimmered around her body, distorting the air like summer pavement. When she breathed, steam poured from her mouth and nose. "Jinu!" she called out desperately, her translator barely functioning in the extreme heat. "Ground kung breaking apart, you feel it?" He did feel it. The tent floor was vibrating constantly now, and he could hear deep rumbling sounds from below. It sounded like a freight train was running underneath them, except he knew it was the sound of geological processes that normally took centuries happening in minutes. "Listen to me," Nari said, forcing herself to sit up despite her obvious distress. "My body temperature, and still climbing, will reach critical point soon. When that happens..." She struggled to find words. "Thermal explosion, like small volcano." Through the tent wall, Jinu could see steam vents opening in the ground around them. Geysers of superheated water were erupting randomly across what had been solid ice just hours ago. The landscape was transforming into something that looked like a volcanic hot springs area. "You have maybe 1 hour," she continued urgently. "Take emergency supplies, walk as far as possible. When thermal peak happens, everything within several kilometers will be changed." She pointed to his survival pack with a trembling, glowing hand. "Please, cannot bear thought of causing your death too." But Jinu was studying his sensor readings with the focused intensity that had made him good at his job. The geological data was terrifying, but it was also information, and information could be used to solve problems. "The steam buildup is following predictable patterns," he said, more to himself than to her. "Underground pressure is creating specific failure points. If I could redirect the pressure release..." "No!" Nari's voice came out as almost a roar, startling both of them. "You think like human, try to fix everything, but this cannot be fixed. Is natural process, must run its course." The tent was shaking violently now. Through the fabric walls, Jinu could see the ground around them cracking and buckling. Steam poured from the fissures, creating an otherworldly landscape of mist and unstable terrain. "My people know this process," she continued desperately. "Have studied it for thousands of years. Only safe choice is distance, far distance." Jinu looked at her, this alien being who was literally glowing like a star, begging him to save himself by abandoning her. Her own crew had made that choice. It was the logical choice, the smart choice. The human choice, apparently, was different. "I'm not leaving," he said simply. "You will die," she screamed, her light flaring so bright that the tent walls began smoking. "Maybe," Jinu admitted, starting to dig through his remaining equipment. "But I've never been great at accepting the obvious solution." The ground beneath them gave a particularly violent shake, and somewhere in the distance they heard the roar of a steam explosion. While Nari pleaded with him to run, Jinu was already tearing apart his damaged research equipment with the desperate efficiency of someone who had no other choice. His archaeological survey gear included metal panels designed to shield sensitive instruments from harsh planetary conditions. Those panels were made from advanced heat-resistant alloys that could handle extreme temperature variations. "What are you doing?" Nari gasped as he dragged pieces of equipment toward her, despite the dangerous heat radiating from her body. "Building something that probably shouldn't work," Jinu replied, sweat streaming down his face as he positioned the first panel between her and the tent wall. The metal immediately began glowing cherry red, but it held its shape. His geological survey equipment included cooling systems designed to keep delicate sensors functional in extreme environments. Those systems used liquid coolant circulation, heat exchangers, and thermal regulation technology. Jinu had never tried to scale them up to handle something like this, but the basic principles were sound. Working with tools that were almost too hot to touch, he began connecting the cooling system's heat exchanger coils to the metal panels. The idea was simple in theory: capture Nari's heat output and channel it through a controlled system instead of letting it build up randomly in the environment. "This is insane," he muttered, as he jury-rigged connections between components that were never meant to work together. Completely insane. The tent was becoming uninhabitable. The fabric walls were smoking and beginning to char. Jinu had to work faster, his hands burning every time he touched metal components. But he couldn't stop now. Through the damaged tent walls, he could hear the ground continuing to crack and steam. "Jinu, please," Nari begged. "Cannot control heat. Output will destroy your equipment." "Then we better make sure the equipment can handle it," he replied grimly. He connected his portable power cells to improvised fans made from survey drone propellers, creating forced air circulation through the heat exchanger system. The setup looked like something a crazy inventor would build in a garage, all mismatched parts and desperate improvisation. But it was actually based on solid engineering principles. The key insight was treating Nari like the heat source in a power generation system. Instead of trying to stop her thermal output, he would capture it and redirect it in a controlled way. Her body heat would flow through the metal panels, transfer to the cooling system, and get dispersed through the circulation fans. As he worked, the system began showing signs of success. The panels were glowing hot, but they weren't melting. The coolant was circulating, carrying heat away from Nari's immediate area. The fans were moving superheated air through the system, instead of letting it build up in dangerous concentrations. "It's actually working," Jinu said in amazement, as his improvised temperature readings showed the heat around Nari becoming more manageable. Nari stared at him with those mirror-like eyes, clearly shocked that his desperate plan was having any effect at all. Her translator was barely functional, but she managed to convey her disbelief. "Impossible. No one has ever controlled thermal flowering before." But Jinu was already making improvements to his makeshift system. He repositioned panels to create better heat flow patterns. He adjusted the coolant circulation to maximize heat transfer efficiency. He even managed to rig up a crude exhaust system that vented the hottest air outside the tent through improvised ducts. "The secret is not fighting the process," he explained as he worked, "just giving it somewhere safe to go." For the first time since her transformation had begun, Nari's intense glow seemed to stabilize rather than continuing to build toward catastrophic levels. The ground beneath them was still unstable. Steam was still venting from cracks around their campsite, but the immediate threat of thermal explosion was being contained by human stubbornness and improvised engineering. Over the next several hours, something remarkable happened. Jinu's chaotic collection of salvaged equipment began working like a real thermal management system. The metal panels absorbed Nari's intense heat output and transferred it through the coolant lines at a steady, controlled rate. Instead of building up to dangerous levels, her thermal energy was being captured and redirected. But Jinu realized he could do more than just contain the heat. He could actually use it. Working carefully around the glowing panels, he connected his dead emergency systems to the thermal exchange network. The massive amount of heat Nari was generating could power his communication equipment, charge his depleted batteries, and run life support systems far better than his original power sources ever could. "Look at this," he said excitedly, showing Nari the displays on his revived equipment. "Your thermal flowering isn't just contained, it's powering everything we need to survive." Nari watched in amazement as systems that had been dead since the storm came back online one by one. Her heat output was being converted into electricity through improvised thermoelectric generators. The same biological process that should have been destroying the landscape was now providing clean, abundant energy. "My people never considered this approach," she said through her translator, which was now working perfectly thanks to the steady power supply. "Always saw thermal flowering as destructive force to be isolated." As the hours passed, Nari's condition began to stabilize in ways that surprised both of them. Instead of the wild, uncontrolled heat spikes that had characterized the early stages of her transformation, her thermal output became steady and manageable. The controlled environment Jinu had created was allowing her body to complete its biological process without the usual chaos. Her skin still glowed with soft blue-white light, but now the luminescence seemed purposeful rather than desperate. She discovered she could consciously adjust her heat output, dimming or brightening the glow as needed. For the first time since her transformation began, she looked peaceful rather than frightened. "This is extraordinary," she said, holding up her hands and watching the light pulse in rhythm with her thoughts. "I can control it. The thermal flowering is complete, but I retain conscious command of the heat generation." Jinu monitored his instruments with growing excitement. The ground beneath them had stabilized. The dangerous steam buildup had stopped. His thermal management system was maintaining perfect environmental balance, with Nari's heat output exactly matching the system's capacity to handle it. "Your equipment has created ideal conditions for metamorphosis," she explained. "Usually thermal flowering is traumatic because the individual has no control over the process. Heat builds until biological systems are overwhelmed. But your system allowed gradual, controlled transformation." She stood up carefully, her movements now graceful and confident. The intense heat that had made it impossible to get near her was now regulated to comfortable levels. She could choose to increase her thermal output when needed, or reduce it to barely above normal body temperature. "I feel complete," she said, wonder evident in her voice even through the translator. "Like I have gained new abilities rather than survived a dangerous ordeal." Jinu's communication systems suddenly crackled to life. His emergency beacon, powered by Nari's thermal output, was broadcasting a strong signal for the first time since the storm. His long-range sensors showed clear readings of the surrounding area. The landscape around their camp had changed dramatically, but not in the catastrophic way everyone had expected. Instead of a destroyed wasteland, the area looked like a natural hot springs region, with stable geothermal features and clear, warm pools where solid ice had once existed. "We did it," Jinu said, hardly believing their success. "You completed your transformation safely, and we turned a natural disaster into a controlled process." Nari looked at him with those silver eyes, now bright with something that looked like joy rather than fear. "Humans," she said softly, "you truly are an unusual species." 2 weeks later, the rescue ships arrived to find something nobody had expected. Instead of a disaster zone or a dead archaeological site, they discovered what looked like a thriving research outpost, nestled in a landscape of natural hot springs and geothermal pools. Steam rose gently from warm water features that had replaced the hostile ice fields, and the whole area had an almost tropical microclimate. The human rescue team landed first, their shuttle touching down on ground that should have been frozen solid, but was instead comfortably warm and stable. Captain Rivera, the mission commander, stepped out expecting to find either survivors in desperate condition or no survivors at all. What she found was Jinu waving cheerfully from a camp that was clearly operating far better than any emergency shelter should. His equipment was running perfectly, his communications were crystal clear, and he looked healthier than when he'd first arrived on Frost 7, Jinu Park, Captain Rivera called out, still trying to process what she was seeing. "We received your emergency beacon. Are you injured? Do you require immediate medical attention?" "I'm fine, Captain," Jinu replied with a grin. "Better than fine, actually. I'd like you to meet someone." Nari emerged from what appeared to be a permanent shelter, built from salvaged materials and natural stone formations. Her appearance had stabilized into something truly remarkable. Her skin held a subtle luminescence that seemed to shift with her emotions, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had gained complete mastery over abilities that once terrified her. "Greetings," she said through her translator, which now worked flawlessly. "I am Nari of the thermal communes. I apologize if my presence here caused confusion for your rescue protocols." Captain Rivera stared at both of them, trying to understand how a stranded human and an alien had not only survived together, but had apparently thrived. Before she could ask questions, another ship descended from orbit, this one clearly of alien design. The alien rescue vessel landed nearby, and several beings who shared Nari's basic physiology but lacked her luminescent skin emerged. Their leader, who introduced himself as Commander Keth, approached with obvious confusion and concern. "Nari," he said in their musical language, his translator converting the words for everyone present. "We monitored seismic activity consistent with thermal flowering. We came to collect your remains and assess environmental damage." Nari laughed, a sound that came through as melodic even through the mechanical translation. "As you can see, Commander, rumors of my destruction have been greatly exaggerated." Over the next hour, both rescue teams listened in amazement as Nari and Genu explained what had happened. They described the thermal flowering process, Genu's improvised containment system, and how they had turned a potentially catastrophic biological event into a controlled beneficial process. Commander Keth examined Genu's thermal management system with the fascination of someone seeing impossible technology work perfectly. "This approach contradicts everything we know about thermal flowering," he admitted. "For millennia, our people have believed isolation was the only safe option." "Humans have a different perspective on impossible problems," Nari explained to both groups. "Where others see disaster, they see engineering challenges. Where others see unchangeable natural processes, they see systems that can be optimized." Captain Rivera was studying the environmental readings her team had collected. "The geothermal features you've created here are completely stable," she reported. "This area has gone from uninhabitable ice wasteland to a sustainable microenvironment. The applications for terraforming research alone." But it was Commander Keith's reaction that really demonstrated the significance of what had happened. He approached Genu with obvious respect, something that clearly surprised his own crew. "Human Genu," he said formally, "your actions have challenged fundamental assumptions of our species. You have shown that what we considered an individual burden can become a shared opportunity." As both rescue teams prepared detailed reports on the situation, it became clear that this incident would have far-reaching implications. The human tendency to treat disasters as problems to be solved, rather than events to be endured, had created possibilities that neither species had previously imagined. "You know what the best part is?" Genu said to Nari as they watched the ships prepare for departure. "We're going to have company next time someone goes through thermal flowering. No more abandoning people to face it alone." Nari smiled, her skin glowing softly with contentment. "Humans," she said, "you really are remarkable. Problem solvers." He had no idea what he was really getting himself into.